Somewhere northwest of Saigon, in a stretch of jungle so thick the canopy blocked out the sun at midday, an entire armored cavalry regiment was doing something nobody thought was possible. They were running M48 Patton tanks and armored personnel carriers through triple canopy jungle, smashing through vegetation that was supposed to stop them, hunting an enemy that had owned this ground for years. The skeptics back at MACV said armor had no place in Vietnam. The men of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Blackhorse, were about to prove every single one of them wrong. It was September 7, 1966, when Colonel William W. Cobb brought the Blackhorse Regiment ashore at Vung Tau in 3rd Corps. Cobb was the 34th Colonel of the regiment, a man tasked with taking 3,762 troopers and their heavy vehicles into a war that most of the army brass believed belonged to the infantry. The prevailing wisdom was simple. Vietnam was a counterinsurgency. Armor was for the plains of Europe. Tanks and tracks would bog down in the paddies, get chewed up by mines, and offer fat targets on narrow jungle roads. That was the thinking, and it was dead wrong. Cobb set up Blackhorse base camp south of Xuan Loc, and within weeks his squadrons were rolling out on reconnaissance in force operations across the provinces surrounding Saigon. The regiment had done something smart before it ever left Fort Meade. They had redesigned their M113 armored personnel carriers, bolting on 2 M60 machine guns with protective gun shields at the rear and adding a shield around the 50 cal up front. The result was a vehicle they called the ACAV, the Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle. Fast, maneuverable, armored, and packing serious firepower. That modification changed everything. The ACAV could go places infantry could go, but they brought a wall of steel and lead with them when they got there. Now here is a detail that tells you everything about the Blackhorse mentality. Their motto, their actual working philosophy out in the bush, was not some polished army slogan. It was this: find the bastards, then pile on. That was it. 5 words that defined how they fought for over 5 years. By January 1967, barely 4 months in country, the Blackhorse was already in the thick of some of the biggest operations of the war. Operation Cedar Falls kicked off on January 8, 1967, a massive sweep through the Iron Triangle north of Saigon. The purpose was to locate and destroy Viet Cong infrastructure, tunnel complexes, and supply caches that had been built up for years right under the noses of Allied forces. The 11th ACR drove into the triangle alongside the 1st Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade. The results were staggering. 700 enemy killed, 1,100 bunkers destroyed, 400 tunnels collapsed, nearly 4,000 tons of rice captured, along with hundreds of weapons and almost 500,000 pages of documents. Let that number sit for a second. 500,000 pages. But Cedar Falls was just the warm-up. The real test for the Blackhorse in War Zone C came 5 weeks later. On February 22, 1967, Operation Junction City began. This was the largest single Allied operation of the entire Vietnam War, and it was aimed squarely at War Zone C, the vast enemy-controlled territory stretching from Tay Ninh province to the Cambodian border. The purpose was to find and destroy the Central Office for South Vietnam, known as COSVN, the enemy's entire command and control apparatus for the war in the South. American intelligence believed COSVN was a fixed headquarters, something like a jungle Pentagon, and they wanted it gone. The scale of Junction City was enormous. 22 U.S. infantry battalions, 4 South Vietnamese battalions, 17 artillery battalions, 4,000 Air Force sorties, 249 helicopters, and at the southern end of the whole operation, serving as the hammer that would drive the enemy into the anvil of infantry and airborne forces positioned to the north and west, was the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, alongside the 2nd Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division. Consider the scope of that for a moment. The entire operation formed a giant horseshoe around War Zone C. The 25th Division blocked the west along the Cambodian border. The 1st Infantry Division held the north. The 173rd Airborne sat in the northeast, its paratroopers having made the only combat jump of the entire war, 845 men out of C-130s into a drop zone north of Khartoum. And from the open end of the horseshoe to the south, the Blackhorse came roaring in. The first phase went smoothly. Objectives were reached without heavy resistance. On February 23rd, the mechanized hammer of the 11th ACR and the 25th Division's 2nd Brigade struck north against the anvil of infantry and airborne positioned to the west and north. The enemy, 4 Viet Cong regiments defending War Zone C, including the 271st and 272nd Regiments of the 9th VC Division, initially avoided contact. They were not looking for a stand-up fight against American armor. But that changed on March 18, 1967, when General Bruce Palmer Jr., the new commander of 2nd Field Force, Vietnam, launched the second phase. This time the 1st Infantry Division and the 11th ACR drove directly east, reinforced with 3 additional brigades. The very next day, March 19th, the enemy decided to fight. The Battle of Ap Bao Bang Tu erupted when the 273rd Viet Cong Regiment attacked an American fire support base and an ambush position established by elements of the 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry. And this was no hit and run. This was a full regimental assault. Heavy fighting, automatic weapons, rockets, mortars, the kind of intensity that separates routine operations from the engagements that get battle streamers. But American firepower was overwhelming. Artillery poured in. Airstrikes hammered the tree lines. The 273rd Regiment was forced to break contact and withdraw. When the smoke cleared, 227 enemy soldiers were dead and 3 captured. American losses were 3 killed and 63 wounded. That ratio alone should tell you something about what happened when the enemy chose to stand and fight against combined American armor and firepower. And they tried again. On March 21st, the 272nd VC Regiment and attached artillery elements hit the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division at Fire Support Base Gold near Sue Tre. Another major assault, another bloody repulse. Then again on April 1st at Ap Guai against the 1st Infantry Division. Each time, the enemy threw regimental strength forces at American positions. Each time, they were shattered. The Blackhorse was in the middle of all of it, pushing through War Zone C, clearing roads, uncovering cache after cache of weapons, ammunition, rice, and documents. The ACAVs and the M48 Pattons would crash through the bush, their tracks chewing up the undergrowth. The 50 Cals and M60s ready to open up the instant contact was made. When they found a bunker complex, they did not wait for infantry to dismount and clear it on foot. They drove through it, crushing the overhead cover, collapsing the fighting positions, and finishing with a sweep of the wreckage. When Junction City finally ended on May 14, 1967, the numbers painted a brutal picture. Over 2,700 enemy killed, 282 Americans lost, 366,000 rounds of artillery fired, over 3,000 tons of bombs dropped, and the enemy, recognizing what they were up against, made the only rational decision available to them. They moved the bulk of their main force units across the border into Cambodia. Army Chief of Staff General Harold K. Johnson said it plainly. The Blackhorse Regiment in Vietnam has successfully silenced those who doubted the effectiveness of armor in this counterinsurgency environment. Coming from the top soldier in the army, that was not a casual compliment, that was an institutional admission that the doubters had been wrong and the Blackhorse had been right. And the regiment never let up. 9 different colonels would command the Blackhorse during its time in Vietnam, and each one brought something to the fight. One of the saddest days in the regiment's history came when Colonel Leonard D. Holder, the 37th colonel of the regiment, was killed in a helicopter accident on March 21, 1968, just weeks after taking command. He is the only colonel of the regiment to have died while commanding it. Then came Tet. On January 31, 1968, the enemy launched simultaneous attacks across the entire country. Bien Hoa, Long Binh, Saigon itself, the largest American logistics base in Vietnam, was under direct assault, and the Blackhorse was 80 miles away. What happened next became a trademark of the regiment. The 11th ACR received its alert notice and moved 80 miles. At night, through contested territory, enemy forces were operating along the route. It did not matter. 14 hours after the initial alert, the Blackhorse rolled into the Long Binh and Bien Hoa area, ready to fight. That kind of speed over that kind of distance in those conditions was something no infantry unit could match. That was the whole point of armored cavalry. When something needed to happen fast, you sent the men on tracks. The regiment secured 2nd Field Force headquarters, locked down the 3rd Corps prisoner of war compound, and began conducting operations across 6 provinces. The fighting was intense, sustained, and exactly the kind of war the Blackhorse was built for. Enemy formations that had infiltrated the urban areas now found themselves pinned between American infantry holding the perimeters and armored cavalry columns slamming into their flanks. That summer brought a new commander who carried one of the most famous names in American military history. Colonel George S. Patton, the son of the World War II legend, took command of the 11th ACR in July 1968. He was the 39th colonel of the regiment. Patton did not trade on his father's name. He earned his reputation the hard way, in combat. He gave his men a standing order: find the bastards and pile on, same motto the regiment had been living by since it arrived. But Patton meant it with a personal intensity that was impossible to miss. He flew his command and control helicopter over the battlefield constantly, was shot down 3 times, and earned 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and 27 Air Medals. On August 9, 1968, during a search operation near Chan Yu-lu, north of Saigon, ARVN troops attached to the regiment hit fierce resistance from enemy soldiers fighting out of tunnels beneath the village. Patton ordered his staff to cover him, grabbed a smoke grenade because he could not find a frag, and advanced directly toward the enemy position under heavy fire. He threw the grenade into a tunnel, opening. 16 enemy killed, 99 suspected Viet Cong captured. 1 man, 1 smoke grenade, running straight at the guns. A month later, on September 5th, Patton was in his helicopter when he spotted 58 NVA soldiers attempting to break out of an encirclement his troops had established. He ordered his door gunners to engage and then told his pilot to land right in the middle of it. He got out and fought on the ground until the enemy force was destroyed. That earned him his first DSC. His second came on September 24th when he landed his helicopter under fire near Chanlu, repositioned ARVN Rangers who had lost their commanding officer, blasted enemy positions with a grenade launcher, and personally led a charge that destroyed a fortified house and a bunker underneath it. He crawled across open ground to throw a grenade into the bunker entrance, and when that was not enough, he came back with 2 men and TNT. General Westmoreland later wrote that Patton did not concern himself with his last name. He went out and made a career, earning everything on his own. He did a very good job in command of the 11th ACR, and handled himself professionally. James Dozier, who served with Patton in the Blackhorse, put it more directly. He just had an instinct for doing the right thing at the right time in combat, and many American soldiers are alive today because George Patton was their boss. After Patton came Colonel James A. Leach, the 40th colonel of the regiment, who brought another innovation. In August 1969, an entire ACAF troop was airlifted by C-130 aircraft to a new operational area. This meant the regiment could be in contact at night, fly to a new location by morning, and be fighting again by evening at a completely different spot. The enemy could not predict where the Blackhorse would appear next. It was cavalry at its finest, using speed and mobility to keep the enemy off balance. But the biggest moment was still coming. On December 7, 1969, Colonel Donn Starry took command. Starry was the 41st colonel of the regiment, and he would lead the Blackhorse into its most dramatic operation of the war. By April 1970, the decision had been made at the highest levels to strike the enemy's sanctuaries inside Cambodia. For years, the NVA had been staging troops, stockpiling supplies, and running command operations from bases just across the border, knowing American forces would not follow. That was about to change. The 11th ACR received just 72 hours to refit, resupply, and move into a staging area south of the Cambodian fishhook, a bulge of Cambodian territory that jutted into South Vietnam about 70 miles north of Saigon. 3rd Squadron, which was the farthest away, had to road march 145 kilometers to reach its assembly area. On the morning of May 1, 1970, 36 B-52s dropped 774 tons of bombs along the southern edge of the fishhook. An hour of massed artillery followed, then another hour of tactical airstrikes, and then the ground forces moved. The 1st Cavalry Division, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, ARVN Armor, and Airborne, 15,000 troops in a combined assault under Task Force Shoemaker. At 10:30, the Blackhorse crossed into Cambodia. Colonel Starry described it simply. In a sense, it is classic tank warfare. The initial thrust was slow and deliberate. ACAVs and Pattons pushed through the jungle, uncovering cache after cache of enemy supplies. But the next night, the mission changed. The 11th ACR was ordered to drive 25 miles northeast to the city of Snuol, a critical road junction where routes 7 and 13 intersected. They had 48 hours to get there and take it. The Blackhorse shifted gears. The tracks hit Route 7 and started racing north at 35 miles per hour. Starry remarked that the last time they had moved like that was during Tet of 1968, when they raced to reinforce Long Bin. Same regiment, same speed, same absolute commitment to getting there first. Near Snuol, they ran into heavy resistance, NVA fortifications, anti-aircraft positions, fire from the tree lines and from the town itself. On the airstrip south of the city, Colonel Starry, Major Frederick M. Franks, and 4 other Americans were trying to coax enemy soldiers out of their bunkers. One came out, the other threw a grenade. All 6 Americans were wounded, including Starry. He dove into Franks, trying to knock him clear of the blast. Franks survived, but lost part of his left foot. Starry, who had not worn his flak vest that day, took shrapnel across his body. He refused evacuation to Japan, designed his own rehabilitation program in a field hospital, and was back with his regiment within days. Think about that, the regimental commander wounded by a grenade, refusing to leave his men. Franks, by the way, would go on to become a 4-star general and command the armored forces that destroyed the Republican Guard during the Gulf War. He learned how to fight in the Blackhorse. When Snuol was secured, 148 enemy lay dead. The Blackhorse controlled the junction, and in the weeks that followed, the systematic search of the surrounding area produced a discovery that stunned even the most optimistic planners. One site alone, which the troops dubbed the city, covered 3 square kilometers. Mess halls, a livestock farm, supply issuing stations, over 200 caches of weapons and material, most of it factory new. The numbers from the Cambodian incursion were staggering. Enough weapons and ammunition to equip 55 enemy infantry battalions captured or destroyed. Main force offensives against 3rd and 4th Corps were derailed for at least a year. The enemy's logistical backbone along the border was broken. The Blackhorse Regiment departed Vietnam on March 7, 1972, after 5.5 years of continuous combat, 11 battle streamers, 3 Medal of Honor recipients, countless innovations in armored warfare that the Army would carry forward for decades. As the last troopers left, Colonel Wallace H. Nutting, the 43rd Colonel of the regiment, told them simply, "We have all been privileged to ride together with the Blackhorse in the cause of freedom. There is much on which we can look with pride. Stand tall in the saddle. Allons, the regimental motto. It means, let us go in French. For the men of the Blackhorse, it always meant something more. It meant forward, into it. No matter what was waiting on the other side of the tree line, you went, and when they told the world that armor could not fight in the jungle, the Blackhorse went anyway, and proved them all wrong.